What the Earth actually looked like when the Ice Age giants dominated the world, a journey into the Pleistocene. 20,000 years ago, the planet you stand on right now looked nothing like what you think it did, not even close. You've probably imagined the Ice Age as this frozen wasteland where giant creatures trudged through endless snow, barely surviving on whatever scraps they could find. Starvation, cold, desperation. Right? Wrong. The reality is something far stranger, and frankly, it changes how we understand these animals entirely. The secret I'm going to reveal at the end of this video explains why the Ice Age wasn't a death trap at all. It was actually a paradise, a golden age of abundance that shaped some of the most sophisticated ecosystems North America has ever seen. Stay with me. If you've never commented on our channel before, this is the moment. Tell me in the comments below, when you picture an Ice Age giant, what's the first animal that comes to mind? Mammoth? Saber-tooth cat? Giant ground sloth? I want to know what your instinct is, because by the time we finish, that image is going to transform. Hold on, I need you to focus on something crucial for just a moment. Everything you're about to learn in the next few minutes rests on understanding one simple fact that most people get backwards. But before we continue, I should tell you this. Our complete guide to the Pleistocene megafauna of North America, the ecosystem maps, the behavioral patterns, the climate data that explains why these creatures thrived, all of it is available in the description and pinned in the top comment. It's a paid resource, and it's where you'll find the detailed keys that unlock the mechanisms behind what I'm explaining here. The mistake people make is thinking of the Ice Age as a single, monolithic climate, one endless winter, one unchanging landscape, one frozen prison. That's wrong. The Pleistocene wasn't one world, it was dozens of worlds, shifting and changing across millennia, between 2.6 million years ago and 11.70 years ago. The planet cycled through multiple glacial and interglacial periods. Each one lasted thousands of years. Each one transformed the landscape into something fundamentally different. What people don't understand is that the periods when the ice sheets were at their maximum, those crushing cold snaps that lasted 5,000, 10,000 years, were actually the minority. Most of the Pleistocene was warmer, much warmer. The climate swung like a pendulum, and it swung hard. During the warmer phases, called interglacials, temperatures in North America rivaled what we experience today. Sometimes they exceeded them. Forests expanded, grasslands flourished, and the megafauna responded by diversifying into forms we can barely comprehend now. The famous animals, the woolly mammoths we all think of, those were actually cold-adapted specialists. They showed up relatively late, maybe 200,000 years ago, and they were perfectly designed for the harshest glacial phases. Their thick fur, their hunched backs, their smaller ears than their forest-dwelling cousins. Every adaptation screamed ice and snow. But here's where the story gets complicated. Those woolly mammoths were only part of the picture. The Columbian mammoth, taller, more massively built, with shorter hair, dominated the warmer periods. They roamed the grasslands from the Pacific Northwest to Mexico. Multiple species overlapping at different times, succeeding based on the climate of their moment. The mastodon, a completely different animal, distantly related to mammoths, but with a separate lineage stretching back millions of years, preferred the forested regions. These weren't cold-loving beasts. Mastodons thrived in temperate woodlands where they browsed on trees and shrubs. They were engineers of the landscape. Their feeding behavior shaped entire forests. When mastodons moved through an area, they knocked down trees, created openings, allowed sunlight to penetrate the canopy. That transformation created habitat for other species. It was an entire ecological conversation written across the landscape. Mammoths, mastodons, camels, horses, bison in sizes that dwarf modern species, ground sloths standing 20 feet tall and weighing 8 tons, saber-tooth cats with canines the length of daggers, Dire wolves built like barrels, with teeth like a nightmare. Dire bears massive enough that a grizzly would look like a cub beside them. This wasn't an ecosystem barely clinging to survival. This was a world of abundance, of redundancy, of ecological depth that most of us have no framework to understand anymore. The real story of the Ice Age isn't about ice, it's about what grew around it. The vegetation that covered North America during the last glacial maximum wasn't what we'd call tundra, despite what most textbooks claim. It wasn't barren, it wasn't sparse. Instead, imagine something closer to a steppe, a grassland that stretched from what is now the Atlantic seaboard west into what we call the Great Plains, and further still into territories that are now deserts and mountains. These grasslands were thick with nutrient-rich plants, mosses, shrubs, and low-growing willows. The ground never stayed bare for long. Where ice scraped away the soil in the north, pioneer plants colonized the raw earth almost immediately. Nitrogen-fixing legumes arrived first, sedges followed, then the grasses, then the animals came to eat them. This created what ecologists call a mosaic ecosystem. Not every region looked the same. What you found in what is now Ohio differed dramatically from what you'd encounter in the territory that would eventually become California. Deciduous forests stretched across the southeast and Midwest, but they were interrupted by grassland corridors. Rocky Mountain valleys held their own distinct communities of plants and animals. The Mammoth Steppe, that's the term paleontologists use for the vast grassland that stretched from modern Siberia into Alaska and down into central North America, supported populations that numbered in the millions, tens of millions by some estimates, and they were all eating continuously. A single mammoth consumed roughly 300 pounds of vegetation per day. A mastodon, being slightly smaller, needed perhaps 200. Dire wolves, which hunted in packs of anywhere from 4 to 12 individuals, required their own share of meat. Saber-tooth cats were solitary or paired hunters, but they were voracious. The energy demands of this entire system were staggering. It required a landscape so productive, so relentlessly green and growing, that it could sustain apex predators and mega herbivores in densities we've never seen replicated in the modern world. The predators themselves shaped the entire system. This is crucial. Dire wolves weren't just scavengers waiting for things to die of old age. They were active hunters. Saber-tooth cats weren't ambush predators that occasionally struck lucky. They were specialized killers that hunted the largest animals alive. Their presence meant that the herbivores, the mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the enormous bison, were constantly under pressure. That pressure kept them moving, kept them from overeating any single region, kept the ecosystem dynamic instead of static. And this is where the relationship between predators and prey becomes something almost musical. The wolves hunt, the herds move, the vegetation recovers, the population of wolves adjusts based on available prey. The cycle continues. It's not balance in the static sense, it's balance as constant motion. Every species was locked into a relationship with every other species. Remove one, and the entire system begins to unravel. Hold on, there's something essential you need to understand about how these ecosystems functioned, and it's something most standard textbooks gloss over. The complete picture of Pleistocene North America, the mechanisms that held these communities together, and the specific reasons certain species thrived while others struggled. All of that is explored in extraordinary depth in our comprehensive guide, available right now in the description below and pinned in the comments. This is a resource built specifically to show you the ecological relationships, the climate patterns, and the survival strategies that most people never learn about. It's a paid guide, but it contains the real architecture of how this lost world actually worked. You'll find it waiting for you. Back to what made this world extraordinary. The diversity wasn't just about the number of species. It was about ecological redundancy. Multiple species filled similar roles. If one predator species failed, others could compensate. If one herbivore struggled, a dozen alternatives existed. The system had resilience. It could absorb shocks. It could adapt. At least, it appeared to. The truth about that resilience, though, is more complicated than it sounds. Yes, the ecosystem had redundancy. Yes, multiple species filled overlapping niches. But that very richness masked a fragility most people never consider. These weren't separate independent communities. They were locked together in patterns so specific, so dependent on precise climatic conditions, that any shift threatened the whole structure. Take the megaherds. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, bison, they grazed across open grasslands and tundra steppe. These animals weren't just eating vegetation, they were actively shaping it. Mammoths knocked down trees. Their feeding habits kept forests from encroaching on grasslands. Their migration patterns distributed nutrients across thousands of miles. Remove the mammoths, and the landscape itself would transform. Grassland would revert to scrub. Scrub would become forest. The entire stage would change, and with it, every actor on that stage. The predators were equally critical, though in ways that seem counterintuitive. Saber-tooth cats and dire wolves didn't just hunt the weak or the injured. Their predation pressure shaped how prey species moved, where they gathered, when they migrated. A prey animal hunted actively moves differently than one living unmolested. It avoids certain areas. It maintains greater vigilance. Those behavioral changes ripple outward. They affect vegetation patterns in those avoided zones. They influence which plants survived and which were browsed to extinction. Now, before we go further, I need to pause on something critical. The mechanisms underlying these ecological relationships, the feedback loops, the tipping points, the climate triggers that would eventually destabilize everything, these require a much deeper framework than what I can cover in this video alone. Our in-depth guide, available now in the description and pinned in the top comment, walks through the complete ecological architecture of Pleistocene North America. You'll find the specific climate thresholds, the extinction cascades, the precise sequences of environmental change that transformed a thriving megafauna ecosystem into something fundamentally different. This is where the real patterns emerge. It's a paid resource designed to give you the complete picture. What happened during the last glacial maximum, roughly 22,000 years ago, offers a window into how sensitive this system truly was. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets expanded. Sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet. The coastlines that humans would eventually follow when they arrived looked nothing like modern shores. And across the continent, the climate became more extreme in ways that seemed subtle but proved catastrophic for specific species. The great megaherbs, those massive ground sloths, were particularly vulnerable to this intensification. These weren't cold-adapted animals in the way mammoths were. Ground sloths had evolved in warmer climates. They had relatively thin skin, limited ability to regulate temperature in extreme cold, and a digestive system optimized for browsing on vegetation that grew in temperate or subtropical conditions. As the climate shifted toward greater extremes, the plants they depended on became harder to find. Winters became longer. Growing seasons compressed, the quality of available browse declined. Yet ground sloths persisted. They adapted. They survived the maximum glaciation. They made it through thousands of years of conditions that should have eliminated them. The question is why? Why didn't they go extinct at that peak? Why did extinction come later, after conditions actually began improving? That's the genuinely puzzling part. The worst climate conditions didn't kill them. Survival isn't simple. It's not a matter of temperature or food availability alone. It's about the intricate balance between dozens of variables. When one variable changes, animals adjust. Behavior shifts. Migration routes change. Populations redistribute. For thousands of years, the megafauna of North America adjusted. But adjustment has limits. Every animal has a threshold. There's a point beyond which flexibility becomes impossible. For some species, that threshold was reached earlier than for others. For some, it wouldn't be reached until much later, until new variables entered the equation entirely, variables that had nothing to do with ice or climate. The megafauna didn't vanish overnight. That's the first thing you need to understand about extinction. It's rarely sudden. It's rarely a single catastrophic event that wipes everything out in one season or one decade. Most extinctions are slow. They're processes that unfold across generations. A species feels pressure. Its numbers decline. The pressure increases. The numbers decline further. Eventually, there's nothing left to decline. By 15,000 years ago, the mammoths themselves were facing consequences they'd never encountered before. The grasslands were shrinking. The cold was still there, yes, but so was an entirely different problem. The vegetation itself was changing. Grasses were being replaced by shrubs. Shrubs were being replaced by trees. The tundra steppe ecosystem that had sustained mammoths for hundreds of thousands of years was converting into something else. Something that looked less like the open grazing lands they'd evolved to navigate and more like the beginnings of a boreal forest. A woolly mammoth needed certain things: open landscape, abundant grasses, the ability to use its trunk and tusks to clear snow and access vegetation beneath. All of those things were becoming less available, less reliably available. The seasonal patterns that had governed their lives for millennia were destabilizing. Mastodons handled the transition differently. They were forest browsers, remember. Their teeth were adapted for crushing branches and bark. As the landscape became more densely wooded, that actually created opportunity. Opportunity, at least for a time. Mastodons expanded their range. They moved into regions that mammoths had abandoned. They thrived in the new forests in ways mammoths simply couldn't. But there's a limit to how much any species can adapt its behavior and still remain viable. And here's where I need to pause and say this clearly. Before we continue, I need you to understand something fundamental about what we're discussing. The mechanisms that govern these extinctions, the actual mechanisms, they're far more complex than the simple narratives usually suggest. That's precisely why our complete guide to Pleistocene extinctions covers these dynamics in depth. It's available in the description and pinned in the top comment. It's a paid resource, and it walks through the actual evidence, the competing theories, and the timeline of decline for each species. If you want to truly understand what killed the giants, that guide is where you'll find the signals that most documentaries miss. The carnivores faced their own transformation. Dire wolves depended on megafaunal prey. Their entire evolutionary strategy, their pack structure, their size, their strength, all of it was calibrated to hunt animals like mammoths and ground sloths and camels. As those prey species became scarce, dire wolves faced a choice that wasn't really a choice. Adapt to hunting smaller prey which they were poorly designed to pursue with any efficiency, or starve. Saber-tooth cats had the same problem, only more acute. A saber-tooth cat was an apex predator unlike any alive today. Those canines weren't just weapons. They were the entire logic of the animal's existence. You don't have teeth like that and hunt anything smaller than a horse. You're built for megafauna. You're built for animals that weigh 3,000 pounds or more. When those animals vanished, so did the reason for the saber-tooth cat's existence. The timeline matters. Some extinctions happened quickly. The dire wolves were largely gone by 14,000 years ago. Most saber-tooth cats had disappeared by 13,000 years ago. But mammoths persisted in certain refuges. Small populations survived on Arctic islands for another 3,000 years after that. Ground sloths in the southwestern deserts lasted until roughly 10,000 years ago. Some species vanished in just a few centuries. Others took millennia. The extinction of the megafauna wasn't a single event. It was a cascade of regional collapses, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. That variation is important. It tells us something. If a single climate event had eliminated the megafauna, we'd expect simultaneous extinctions across the continent. We'd see all the giants vanishing at roughly the same time. That's not what happened. The extinctions were staggered, regional. Some populations hung on while others collapsed. That pattern suggests something more complicated than simple climate change, something that operated differently in different places at different times. Humans arrived in North America somewhere between 16,000 and 14,000 years ago. That's the consensus now, though the exact timing remains contested. What matters is this: the arrival of people coincides geographically and temporally with the extinction of specific megafauna populations. Not all of them, not everywhere at once, but in regions where human settlement increased, megafauna diversity declined. The evidence takes different forms depending on location. In the Great Basin, human projectile points appear in the same geological layers as the bones of ground sloths and horses. In Florida, giant armadillos and camels vanish from the fossil record shortly after humans establish permanent settlements. In the Southwest, extinction timing for megafauna follows human population expansion so closely that the correlation becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But, and this is crucial, human hunting alone doesn't fully explain the extinction pattern either. Some megafauna disappeared before humans reached their range. Other species coexisted with humans for thousands of years without apparent decline. Woolly mammoths in Siberia survived human hunting for 4,000 years after their North American cousins vanished. If human predation was the sole cause, why the regional variation? Why the delays? The answer likely involves what scientists call synergistic extinction, multiple stressors compounding. Climate change created resource scarcity and fragmented habitats. That stress made populations more vulnerable. Humans arrived into those already weakened systems and applied additional pressure through hunting and habitat alteration. Neither factor alone would have been lethal. Together, they became catastrophic. Hold on. I need to pause here and stress something, because this is where the picture becomes clear. The relationship between climate, humans, and megafaunal extinction isn't a simple cause and effect story that fits into a neat category. It's a collision, a convergence of multiple pressures happening at different scales simultaneously. The complete mechanisms driving this collapse, how each variable weighted against the others, how regional conditions modified the outcome, what separated the survivors from the extinct, these are explored in exhaustive detail in our comprehensive guide available in the description and pinned comment. That resource lays out the evidence, the competing theories, and the newest research in a way that transforms how you understand this period. It's a paid resource, but it's the deepest dive available on this topic outside of peer-reviewed literature. Consider the Columbian mammoth. These were enormous animals, reaching 12 tons or more. A single mammoth provided enough meat to feed a human band for months. But hunting a mammoth required coordination, planning, and risk. A single tusk could gore a hunter. A charge could kill multiple people. Early human groups developed specialized hunting techniques, sophisticated ambush strategies, coordinated drives, weapons designed specifically for large prey. Archaeological sites in the American Southwest show evidence of these hunts. The Murray Springs site in Arizona contains the bones of 13 mammoths, all killed within a narrow time window, alongside distinctive stone points. The Anzick child burial in western Montana, dated to 12,600 years ago, provides genetic evidence of a boy with direct ancestry to multiple founding populations that dispersed across the continent. These weren't scattered incidents, they were systematic hunts by organized societies. Yet, the extinction of Columbian mammoths wasn't instantaneous. Populations persisted in isolated refugia for centuries after disappearing elsewhere. The Channel Islands off California maintained a population of dwarf mammoths until around 5,700 years ago. That's thousands of years after mainland populations collapsed. Isolation protected them from human hunting pressure, but only temporarily. When humans eventually reached those islands, the mammoths had nowhere to retreat. Ground sloths presented a different target profile. Megatherium, the largest, reached 7 tons and could rear up on hind legs to feed from high vegetation. They were relatively slow-moving, ground-dwelling creatures without the speed or agility of mammoths. Early human hunters may have found them easier prey in some respects. No need for coordinated ambush hunts, potentially weaker defensive capabilities. Yet some ground sloth populations survived into the early Holocene, the period after the Ice Age technically ended. The Shasta ground sloth, a smaller species found in the American Southwest, appears in cave deposits alongside human remains. Coprolites, fossilized feces, from these caves show that humans consumed the ground sloths. But they also left evidence of shelter use, suggesting the humans occupied these caves seasonally. The sloths may have used them during different seasons. Coexistence, not constant predation. That pattern suggests humans and ground sloths didn't always represent predator and prey in direct competition. Human diet during this period was remarkably flexible. Analysis of coprolites from human settlements shows diets heavy in plants, seeds, tubers, nuts, berries, along with smaller game and megafauna. The megafauna may have been opportunistic prey rather than primary targets. A population of dire wolves killed in a tar pit became accessible meat, a diseased ground sloth representing an easy kill. Mammoths hunted during seasonal migrations when populations were concentrated. That flexibility may have been crucial to human survival and expansion. Humans didn't depend entirely on megafauna hunting, so when megafauna populations declined, human survival wasn't threatened. Yet the presence of humans still altered ecosystems through fire use, habitat modification, and the cumulative effect of harvesting prey regardless of whether those prey species were primary targets. Human populations grew, they spread, they modified landscapes through burning, creating grasslands suitable for hunting, eliminating dense forests that restricted visibility and movement. Those landscape modifications favored some species and eliminated others. Megafauna, adapted to open grasslands and cool climates, suffered as vegetation patterns shifted. The extinction of the megafauna wasn't a murder, it wasn't genocide, it was the collision of two worlds, a climatic system transforming at continental scale. A new predator with novel hunting strategies arriving precisely when food sources were becoming scarce. The megafauna that had survived ice ages, climate oscillations, and predatory competitors for millions of years encountered something their evolution hadn't prepared them for. Not raw predatory power. Humans were smaller and weaker individually, but humans possessed intelligence, social cooperation, and the ability to modify their environment. Those advantages proved decisive. Human survival depended on flexibility. Megafaunal survival depended on stable resources and manageable predation pressure. When both shifted simultaneously, the outcome was foreordained. The giants that had ruled for millions of years faced extinction not from a single catastrophe, but from the cumulative weight of stressors arriving in rapid succession. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The Ice Age giants didn't disappear because they were weak. They vanished because strength itself became irrelevant. A woolly mammoth could weigh 6 tons. A mastodon could reach 9. A dire wolf pack could coordinate hunts that brought down the largest herbivores on the continent. Yet none of that mattered when the environment they depended on was crumbling beneath their feet. The megafauna of North America evolved over millions of years to thrive in a specific world. Grasslands that stretched for hundreds of miles, temperate valleys sheltered from extreme cold, predictable seasonal migrations, reliable water sources, competition from other carnivores that operated under the same ecological rules. That world was their home. They owned it completely. But ownership is fragile when the rules change. The climate shifted too fast for their bodies to adapt. 10,000 years might sound long to us. In evolutionary time, it's nothing. 40 generations. Barely enough for behavioral adjustment, almost nothing for genetic change. A mammoth born in 12,000 BCE might have lived through grasslands that, by the time it was elderly, had become forests with dense vegetation that slowed its movement and reduced its feeding efficiency. Its children faced an even stranger landscape. By their children's time, the world was almost unrecognizable. Humans, meanwhile, possessed something the megafauna didn't: cultural memory. One generation could teach the next, not just through genetics, but through language and knowledge transfer. A hunting technique developed in response to changing conditions could spread across a population in seasons, not millennia. When mammoths became scarcer, humans adapted their diet. When grasslands retreated, humans followed new game trails into new territories. When a particular strategy failed, they invented another. Flexibility was their advantage. Stability was the megafauna's fatal weakness. The giants that survived longest were the ones that could shift their diet most readily. The ground sloths, which could eat vegetation other herbivores couldn't digest, lasted longer than more specialized feeders. Camels and horses, which faced less direct human predation pressure in some regions, persisted longer than mammoths and mastodons. The creatures most bound to a single environmental niche vanished first. But here's what made the difference truly absolute. Humans didn't just hunt the megafauna, they transformed the landscape itself. Fire became a tool. Controlled burns prevented forests from encroaching on grasslands, but they also destroyed vegetation and forced animals away from traditional ranges. Human settlement altered water cycles. The simple act of many people living in one area changed patterns of animal movement for hundreds of miles in every direction. The extinction of the Ice Age megafauna teaches us something vital about survival itself. It's not about being the biggest, the strongest, or the most specialized. It's about being able to change. The mammoths adapted to ice ages. They grew wool. They developed smaller ears to conserve heat. They learned to migrate across frozen terrain. Yet they couldn't adapt to the rapid transformation of their world, combined with a new predator that learned faster than evolution could move. Extinction is rarely sudden. It's almost never the work of a single cause. The mammoths, mastodons, saber-tooths, dire wolves, and ground sloths didn't vanish because humans arrived with spears. They vanished because humans arrived with intelligence, culture, and adaptability precisely when the climate was destabilizing their entire world. That convergence was catastrophic. It wasn't cruelty, it was incompatibility. When you understand this, you understand something about our own time. We live in a world of rapid change. Technology transforms faster than culture can adjust. Climate shifts faster than ecosystems can stabilize. The old rules don't apply anymore, and the question every species faces is simple. Can you change faster than the world around you? The Ice Age giants couldn't. They were ancient, successful, and ultimately inflexible. So ask yourself this week, where in your own life are you specializing so deeply into a single way of being that you might miss the shift coming? Where are you relying on stability that isn't actually guaranteed? The mammoths learned this lesson too late. They learned it in extinction. Thank you for walking through this lost world with me. If you felt that strange pull toward these giants, toward understanding how dominance ends and why adaptability matters more than strength, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next deep exploration into the Pleistocene. There are more stories waiting.